Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday the 9th of November and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm in our studios in Glasgow. First we will have today's coronavirus updates, then I will introduce today's brilliant guest, and then together we will look at the news and headlines from Scotland and around the world. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,486,716 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,819,836 have been confirmed negative and 666,880 have tested positive. Bear with me. There are 2,233 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. I'm sorry to say that there are 20 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,313. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 753 were in hospital last night, 57 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,324,440 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,918,528 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 142,124 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 262 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. Now, we also have an update from the Office for National Statistics this evening. And in the latest week ending the 30th of October 2021, the estimated percentage of the community population that had COVID-19 was 1 in 50 people in England, 1 in 40 in Wales, 1 in 65 in Northern Ireland, and 1 in 80 people in Scotland. There were 1,042 deaths involving coronavirus registered in the UK in the week ending the 29th of October 2021, accounting for 8.2% of all deaths in the UK. This is a 6.9% increase from the 975 deaths registered in the week before. Of these deaths, 777 were registered in England, 81 in Wales, 133 in Scotland, and 50 in Northern Ireland. Now, this evening we're lucky enough to be joined by a regular contributor and friend of the programme, Professor John Robertson. Professor Robertson was the Professor of Politics and Media at the University of West of Scotland, before in return for good behaviour he was allowed to retire. John, good evening, how are you?
I'm well. I really must dispute the good behaviour rumour. It was the reverse.
I don't believe that for a second, but thank you for joining us this evening. It's great to see you.
Pleasure.
Now, firstly, fears are growing for the welfare of Richard Ratcliffe, the husband of the detained Iranian-British dual national Nazanin Zaharie Ratcliffe, who is on the 17th day of his hunger strike outside the Foreign Office. Some of his allies are urging him to stop, saying they are concerned he may damage himself permanently. Richard Ratcliffe is also aware of his responsibility to look after his 7-year-old daughter, Gabriella. But after 5.5 years of no tangible progress, and most campaigning avenues exhausted, Mr. Ratcliffe, who is spending his nights outside the Foreign Office in a tent, does not yet want to back down. Admitting that he felt weaker, he said, "I'm definitely looking rougher and feeling rougher. I don't feel hungry, but I do feel the cold more. It's a short-term tactic. You can't take it too long, or you will end up in a coma." Under one plan, he will end the hunger strike when the Iranian delegation leaves COP26 in Glasgow later this week. He ended a previous hunger strike outside the Iranian embassy in London after 15 days, but that took place in the summer months. the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, on a trip to the Far East this week, spoke on the telephone to the Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian on Monday in what was the latter described as a useful call. He reiterated his demand that the UK urgently repay the long overdue £400 million debt to Iran outstanding since the 1970s. Ms Truss has been privately advised by at least two former Conservative Foreign Office ministers that Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who is out of prison on furlough but due to serve another year's sentence, will not be returned to the UK unless and until the debt is repaid. She's been detained since April 2016. So, John, we've been watching the reports of Richard Ratcliffe's renewed protests outside the Foreign Office. Do you think is anyone else paying any attention to his latest desperate protest and appeal?
It's a tremendously tragic story, and he's a very brave man. I suppose I understand where his courage comes from, but he's working against a trail now of three utterly incompetent and insensitive foreign secretaries, from Boris himself to Dominic Raab and now to the remarkably appointed Liz Truss, a person of very little competence. And, you know, the Iranian regime is extremely harsh, brutal, I think would be a fair word for that. But they do have a case over the loan, or the money that I understand it was given to Britain for shipbuilding of some kind, military ships, and we won't provide the warships for obvious reasons, but for some reason we're not giving them the money back. They have clearly linked the two. It's clear in their minds that there's nothing to do with justice here in her case. She's being used. She's being used to get that money back, and there's no reason why we can't pay it back. And Liz Truss is not the Minister of Defence, but I'm sure she has some kind of influence. And if I can just finish this, we saw, you know, when she met Mr. Radcliffe a few days ago, and I gather gave him little to go on, despite the fact that he's starving himself to death. And then within hours, she was tweeting excitedly, like an immature person that she is, I think, about the possibility now of meeting friends in the US. About no sense of irony that suddenly we're able to reunite with friends in the US if we're double vaccinated. They're just the most appalling group of politicians, aren't they?
Thanks, John. As I recall, it was Centurion tanks that the former Shah of Iran had ordered, as you say, the delivery was cancelled when the regime changed in Iran. But as you also say, the debt has been outstanding since the current regime, since the Iranian Republic was created. So it's about time that the matter is sorted out. I'm sure we'll be two things. We certainly have both Mr. Ratcliffe and his wife in our thoughts, and I'm sure we'll be returning to reporting the story again on Scotland at 7. But I'll move on to the next story this evening, which is that the SNP has written to opposition leaders calling for Parliament to unite against the Tory cash for honour scandal and to end the practice of handing peerages to party donors. In a joint letter today to the Westminster leaders of the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru, the Green Party and other opposition parties, the SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford MP and the SNP shadow leader of the House of Commons Pete Wishart MP called for a cross-party backing for a full investigation into the Tory cash for honour scandal and a commitment to ending the practice of handing peerages to donors once and for all. It comes as an investigation by the Sunday Times and Open Democracy found that all 16 of the main Tory treasurers over the past 2 decades have been handed peerages, after donating millions of pounds to the party. The report found that since 2010, 22 of the party's main financial donors have been given peerages after donating a combined £54 million. In addition, 2 Labour Party and 5 Liberal Democrat major donors have also been handed peerages. Yesterday, Pete Wishart MP made a formal complaint to the Metropolitan Police, calling for an investigation into Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party over suspected breaches of the law, including the Honours Prevention of Abuses Act 1925. And John, I think this afternoon the Met confirmed that they are considering the complaint that Pete Wishart has sent to them. But firstly, John, it strikes me the issue of the latest manifestation of Tory sleaze seems to be spreading. We had Patterson first of all, and now it's spread to second jobs for MPs generally, and now it seems to be spreading to cash for honours. Do you think is Downing Street going to be able to get on top of this now Category 5 political storm?
No, I don't think. I don't think they'll make any real effort to do so, and I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for the Met to do anything about this. The Met will consider it, I'm sure, but they won't have the courage to tackle a political situation like this. You described it as spreading, and it does seem to be spreading. I suppose it's also just uncovering that which was already there. Much of this sleaze goes back many years, and the corruption of this current regime, it puts into perspective anything that's happened before. Satirists in the 1970s, if they had imagined these events that have taken place under Boris Johnson, they would have been laughed at. People would have said it's not plausible. It's just shocking beyond belief.
Thanks, John. It certainly is. But as the story continues to be uncovered, I'm sure we'll be returning to it with you on Scotland at 7. And back in Scotland, an innovative NHS community pharmacy service has helped see patients quickly and relieve pressure on A&E units and GP surgeries by sparing the NHS 200,000 avoidable appointments for treatment of urinary tract infections and skin infections in the last year. The NHS Pharmacy First network of more than 1,200 community pharmacies are the first port of call for minor ailments and common clinical conditions. The NHS Pharmacy First Scotland service has carried out over 2 million consultations since the launch of the service in July 2020. The service provides free access to a consultation with an appropriately qualified member of the pharmacy team who provides advice on self-care, referral to another part of the NHS if they feel it is necessary, and, if appropriate, will also provide treatment. The community pharmacist can also treat certain conditions, such as UTIs, shingles and impetigo, without the need for a prescription or to see a doctor. This is part of a coordinated series of measures to improve patient care and also help reduce demand on A&E. Pharmacists in the network have taken more than 200,000 appointments in the last year, which would otherwise have gone to GP surgeries or hospital A&E departments. Since its launch at the height of the pandemic, only 4% of the patients needed to be referred on to another healthcare professional, such as a GP or a hospital. The majority were handled by the pharmacy team, advice on self-care, or with treatment. So, John, firstly, the NHS Pharmacy First was launched about 18 months ago. Do you think, are there signs that this innovation is working?
It does seem to be working well. I mean, I have certain reservations about the outsourcing of NHS work to pharmacies. These are businesses, and there may be some worries about that. I have to say I've had some experience myself of getting guidance from pharmacists on minor ailments, and I've found them all to be very, very, very helpful in that regard. It seems to me this is a continuation of an earlier study which got very little media attention, and that was pharmacies providing drug abusers with doses of medicines which compensate. I forgot methadone, I think, in particular. And in Scotland, it went really quite well because very clear guidelines were given to the pharmacists. The pharmacists were not able to give extensive amounts of methadone, which can lead to overdoses if people get too much at a time and then are not disciplined in using it. The situation in England was worse. There were some real worries about a surge and in the US, a surge in overdose as a result of pharmacies issuing kind of rather willy-nilly these things. But the development of really good guidelines in Scotland seems to work very well.
Thanks, John. I was actually going to ask you if you had any concerns about consulting a pharmacist for minor ailments, but you've kind of answered the question both in personal terms, but also in policy terms as well.
Yeah, I think GPs might have to be careful here in what they wish for. If the GPs are already devolving much of their work to practice nurses. And my experience of them has been always also very good. They have to be careful here they don't offload so much that we start to think they're not worth as much as they are at the moment.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. And our final story this evening that doesn't relate to COP26 and the events that are ongoing during the second week of the conference is that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, today set out proposals for a new financial regulators framework with an agile and dynamic approach to regulation, which he said will support the growth of the UK economy. His proposals will facilitate the repealing of the majority of the retained EU financial services law and give the UK regulators the powers to replace the law with their own rules, which Mr Sunak claims will result in an adaptable and dynamic UK regime supporting the UK's commitment to high standards of regulation in the future. The plans would require the FCA and the PRA to consider both the implications for growth and international competitiveness of their regulations, as well as their existing objectives of maintaining market integrity, consumer protection, and a sound financial system. The UK Parliament and HM Treasury say they will receive strengthened scrutiny and oversight over the FCA and the PRA, appropriate to the increased rulemaking powers that have been received by the regulators. The review of financial services regulation forms part of the UK government's wider agenda to review UK laws with the stated aim of ensuring that they are tailored to support the best interests of UK businesses and citizens. So John, does the suggestion or the prospect of an agile and dynamic approach to regulations fill you with delight, or does it fill you with dread?
Well, it sounds promising. I have to admit I had to do a bit of preparation for this one. This is not my area. So I did a bit of reading from a Mr. Wolf in the Financial Times, and he points to some problems in this. And it's all very well having regulation, but this is a period, the last decade, and in the forecasts of flatlining wage rises, flatlining productivity, flatlining disposable income. The population out there is not ready to spend. It's not in a position to spend. So, and at the same time, we're talking about increased investment in renewables and in improvements in the environment. And we're also talking about massive increases in the health service and the care services after the pandemic. It's not clear where the money is going to come from that. The Chancellor has already suggested that he's not in the mood to raise taxes, despite the fact that we saw, for example, millionaires and billionaires actually writing to him and saying, tax us more, because the money just lies about if you don't tax us. So I'm not very optimistic, but I have to admit, check Mr. Wolf in the Financial Times if you want a better answer than that.
Thanks, John. And one other thing, it struck me that Rishi Sunak is himself a former investment banker, having worked for several years at Goldman Sachs and then became a fund manager. So do you think, is it possible in his case for the poacher to turn gamekeeper successfully?
Well, I mean, I don't know enough about that. I do know that he's an extremely rich man. He's a multimillionaire. Is he a billionaire? I'm not sure. I think largely through the efforts of his wife, I think, or the connections of his wife. So you're always, I think, in these circumstances, prompted to think cynically that this may benefit him more than it benefits us.
Well, that was my question. Yes, his wife is the daughter of Narayan Murthy, who founded the Indian IT business Infosys, and is at least a one-time over billionaire, if not more than that. So we will see once the detail of this proposed regulation starts to emerge. I'm sure that Mr. Wolf and the FT will be talking about it more, and I'm sure that we will return to looking at it with you on Broadcasting Scotland. But what we'll do now is we'll move to talking further about the COP26 conference, which is now well and truly into its second week here in Glasgow. I will say that part of the agenda today at COP26 related to gender. So whilst gender was on the agenda today at COP26, on Scotland at 7, we'll cover that in detail on Thursday with Maggie. So we'll make sure that the discussions today and the issues that have been raised, which we have touched on and addressed already, will also be examined in detail and discussed further with Maggie on Thursday evening. But what we'll do is we'll look firstly at the headline that emerged this afternoon, which was that the COP26 was setting course for a disastrous heating of more than 2.4 degrees Celsius, says a key report. temperature rises will top 2.4 degrees by the end of the century based on the short-term goals countries have set out, according to research published today in Glasgow. That would far exceed the 2 degrees Celsius upper limit the Paris Accord said that the world needed to stay well below, and also the much safer 1.5 degrees Celsius limit aimed for at these COP26 talks. This estimate stands in sharp contrast to the more optimistic forecasts published last week that suggested heating could be held to 1.9 degrees or 1.8 degrees, thanks to the commitments given at the talks last week. Those estimates were based on the long-term goals set out by countries including India, the world's third biggest emitter, which is aiming for net zero emissions by 2070. By contrast, this sobering assessment of a rise of 2.4 degrees C, which has been received from the Climate Action Tracker, that's the world's most respected climate analysis coalition, was based on countries' short-term goals for the next decade. Bill Hare, the chief executive of Climate Analytics, one of the organisations behind CAT, told The Guardian that we are concerned that some countries are trying to portray COP26 as if the 1.5 degrees C limit is nearly in the bag. But it's not. It's very far from it, he said, and they are downplaying the need to get short-term targets for 2030 in line with 1.5 degrees C. Emissions will be twice as high in 2030 as they need to be to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius based on the promises made in Glasgow so far, CAT has found, and scientists have warned that beyond 1.5 degrees C, some of the damage to the Earth's climate will become irreversible. So John, do you think is this authoritative statement from CAT helping to bring a bit more, how can I put it, sharper, a harder edge profile and a sharper perspective to the messaging that we're hearing from governments and others who are meeting at COP26 this week?
Well, let's hope so, because what's happened at COP26 is what's happened at pretty much all the rest. And, I don't have to be a little Swedish schoolgirl to be cynical about this. Much of that was theatre. Much of it won't be really acted upon. I hate to be negative, but I think the history tells us that the species that we're part of may well survive, but I think we'll probably skirt the edge of the precipice a bit more closely before we do something. Several major partners here, potential partners like China and Russia, are nowhere near on board. So I'm not optimistic. I think we may need a few more COPs before we get near to anything like a kind of agreement that actually leads to real action.
That's a good point, John. Other commentators were pointing out this week that possibly one of the upsides of COP26 is that nations have apparently stopped arguing about the science of climate change and the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And it's taken 26 meetings to get to that point. So that rather underlines your suggestion that it's going to take a good few more meetings in order to actually get proper movement. I was also going to ask you, do you think that folks recognise or are beginning to recognise the distinction between these short-term goals that have been identified by CAT today and the longer-term goals that were driving the announcements last week? It struck me in particular that for politicians perhaps, and you can call me an old cynic, but for politicians and perhaps it's easier for them to make long-term commitments because they won't be around to implement them, whereas short-term commitments have the possibility of biting them because they may still be around. So do you think people have cottoned on to the distinction, and do you think that the distinction has been being misused perhaps or been exploited by politicians so far during the COP conference?
Well, it's one of the kind of built-in problems, contradictions in liberal democracies is, as you pointed out, the politicians are not there for the long term. It'd be extremely rare for any minister to be there for 10 years even. So I think it's an important distinction. I'm not sure, and clearly media commentators have been clarifying that distinction between the long and the short term, and the way in which politicians will abuse our expectations of the long-term solutions. But I'm not sure it's gone far enough. And I return to the point I make earlier. I mean, history tells us that human beings sail very close to the edge before they get together and do something. I think we'll do the same. I don't think it's the end of the world. I don't think human beings will disappear, but I think there will be. I shouldn't smile. There will be mass suffering in many parts of the world. Significant parts of the world will become unlivable before we do anything.
Thanks, John. It's a good point that you make as to whether humankind will be extinguished on the planet. I think there's a recognised view that the planet will persist, whether or not we are around. But to continue mixing the metaphors terribly, Greenpeace International described the CAT report this afternoon as a telescope looking at a giant asteroid that's heading directly for planet Earth. So do you now Greenpeace are always strike me as being very effective at their messaging and at their direct action as well. So do you think that the messaging that we're seeing from Greenpeace about the prospect of calamity on a Hollywood size scale, do you think that messaging is starting to get through, or is it getting lost in the torrent of messaging we're getting from all of the parties at COP26?
Yeah, I think, well, the point you make about the torrent of messages is quite important. And I think that again causes most human beings to think, well, there's just too much information here. I can't cope with it. I'll just go and have a cup of tea and ignore it. That's a great risk. And then if the messages are too dramatic, even if it's accurate, I mean, I don't know how accurate that particular image would be. It seems a wee bit over the top to me, the idea of a huge asteroid coming our way. I think it's more subtle than that. I've said already, I think there will be huge suffering in parts of the world. There already is huge suffering. I mean, that's the nature of this planet we're living on just now, is that human beings in many parts live very unpleasant lives, tough, nasty, short lives. I think that will get worse. But I do think that in certain parts of the globe we'll survive. Rather, I mean, I hate this. I mean, it sounds a bit kind of smug here, but it's beginning to look like that regardless of a comedian's jokes about life in Glasgow. Frankie Boyle's negativity about Glasgow as the most depressing city in the country. I think, or rather ironically, I think Scotland's well placed to survive all this.
That's a very good point, John. I did read that your objections to Mr. Boyle's comedy earlier today, and certainly, to be fair, it struck me, a very similar thought struck me when I was watching as well. But we'll move on. John, you're very much our resident Ayrshire correspondent, and today the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon met with Geraldine Matchett, who's the co-chief executive of Royal DSM, to announce the company's investment of more than £100 million in Scotland, focused on reducing methane emissions from farming. The investment, which has been supported by Scottish Enterprise, will provide the first global manufacturing site for the company's new feed additive, Bovaer, and will also boost the local economy with the safeguarding of jobs and the creation of new jobs, including construction roles. The feed additive has the potential to reduce methane emissions from cattle and sheep by approximately 30%. And speaking ahead of the meeting today, the First Minister said, "I'm pleased to welcome this boost to the Scottish economy, securing the Dalry site's long-term future and safeguarding more than 300 existing jobs with an anticipated increase of job numbers of around 10%. We will also see between 100 and 150 construction jobs created over 2 years. Our vision for the future of agriculture in Scotland is a positive one, with a clear, ambitious aim to transform how we support farming and food production in Scotland to become a global leader in sustainable and regenerative agriculture." So, John, firstly, as I say, as our Ayrshire correspondent, is this good news for Ayrshire and for the people of Dalry?
I think it's especially good news for North Ayrshire. North Ayrshire is one of the areas in Scotland with the highest levels of deprivation, unemployment, and so on. So that is good news to hear that. I think it's also, it strikes me as quite a good strategy. I don't have the figures to hand here, but I understand that methane production as a result of the dairy and the beef industries is huge across the planet, and perhaps greater than some of the things we do ourselves. So that to deal with that in some way, I mean, I had thought we really need to cut back on beef and dairy production, but if we can keep the same level of beef and dairy production but reduce the gases emitting from the animals, then great, well done.
Well, that actually was going to be the next question I was going to ask you, albeit I was also going to speculate that neither you nor I expected that we'd be discussing what is delicately described as or accurately described as enteric methane emissions, but is actually burped methane from cattle. But you were when you were talking there, it struck me that you were talking about a mitigation of the problem rather than looking for solutions which address and fix the problem. And that problem, as you say, is the apparently ever increasing appetite and consumption of meat and dairy around the world. So, do you think is mitigating this problem? Is it, as to use your words, is it just allowing us to cycle closer to the edge of the precipice, or will it make a sufficient impact and dent to the immediate problems of which methane has been identified as being a significant greenhouse gas?
I suppose it will have to be very economic for farmers to actually use feedstuff of that kind. So we'll almost certainly need government subsidies, I think. I mean, again, I'm delighted to say I'm not an expert on cow burping, but I understand it's a massive problem. It looks like this may be a solution. The question is whether it will be adopted quickly enough and widely enough, right across, obviously huge amounts of this activities in South America rather than here. So it may be that it's a bit late, and as you suggested, it may be we need to push a bit harder on the reduction of the industry in the first place, but against tremendous obstacles. I mean, the dairy industry in the United States has huge political clout.
Absolutely right. And just to your point there with regard to cost for farmers, the press release from Royal DSM said today that a quarter of a teaspoon of Bovaer per cow per day consistently reduces enteric methane emission by approximately 30% for dairy cows and up to 90% for beef cows. So it's a quarter of a teaspoon, but as you say, it very much depends how much Royal DSM are proposing to charge per teaspoon for this this new treatment. But
I would have guessed given the size of the average cow, it would be at least a shovelful rather than a teaspoon. But what do I know?
That's a fair comment. It strikes me that also in respect of the announcement as it applies to the production facility at Dalry. Now that Dalry site has been open since the early 50s. I think it was Roche that set it up to manufacture vitamins, and it's now the only production facility for vitamin C in the Western world, according to the owners of the site today. So, do you think that the evolution of this site, moving it from vitamin production to, in this case, additions to feedstuffs for agricultural production, do you think that demonstrates that there is still an appetite for innovation and scientific innovation in particular in the Scottish economy and in businesses that are operating in Scotland?
Yes, well, I think there clearly is. I mean, Scotland has the I think I can say the most educated population in Europe in terms of the number of people with degrees. There's clearly tremendous scope for, at least in that human capital, to be innovative. And if government had the kind of the guts to actually do something about that, and I mean the UK government, I think there would be tremendous opportunities in the past to encourage innovation. I'm hopeful the Scottish government will be able to step into that in the future more, and obviously with full independence, maybe we'll get going somewhere.
That's a very good point that you make, John, and we'll be talking about innovation in Scotland and the political ramifications of that as we go through some further stories this evening. But to finish off this story with regard to Royal DSM and their new product, which is to be manufactured in Dalry in a couple of years' time once the factory has been adjusted, does this indicate a possible pathway for Scottish agriculture to begin to innovate and to help to join the fight against climate change and the climate crisis?
Yeah, I've certainly seen signs and statements by the NFU and sometimes by individual farmers in the media suggesting that there's a kind of an acceptance now that they too get it now, that we're in a very difficult situation, and it's no longer time for them to dig their heels in and try to keep doing things the way they were. So that's encouraging. I've seen several suggestions, as I mentioned, mainly from the NFU, indicating a willingness to adapt.
Thanks, John. Now we'll look at a little bit more innovation in farming and also some presentations and some events that are taking place in COP26 over the past few days. The Broomielaw has been taken over, an empty space on the Broomielaw has been taken over by an exhibition and meeting site, and we sent a camera and a team down there to talk to the organisers and also to one of the exhibitors. And so we'll run that VT now.
This land is actually owned by Scottish Enterprise, and they were kind enough to gift this land over to New Practice Architecture and our own organisation in-house, Event Productions, to put together a fringe event which would welcome members of the public to showcase some of the different sustainable projects that are going on, in which we're calling the site the Sustainable Glasgow Landing. So the idea is we have a social gathering space and interaction and educational space that people can come and spend time in, but also at the same time exhibit some of the technologies and new kind of industry leading products that are coming out there that are relevant to the conference that's going on.
My name is Andrew Lloyd. I'm Chief Operating Officer at Intelligent Growth Solutions, and what we're presenting here is a 6-meter vertical farm. Simply, it allows communities around the world to be able to grow over 150 different types of crops, to be able to relocalize the production of food, and to be able to do that 365 days a year, irrespective of whether it's winter outside or the desert outside. This morning, I had blueberries on my breakfast. They came from South Africa. Last month, they came from Spain. The month before that, they were grown in Scotland. You know, it is no longer sustainable to be flying food from the other side of the world just to satisfy my blueberry taste. So what the plant's like is a perfect summer's day. If you think perfect summer's day in Scotland, that's around 18 hours. So we will give them a sunrise, we will give them a warm middle of the day, and then we will give them a sunset. So the lights is what most of the power is about. So in round numbers, a 9-meter version of this tower will draw 50 kilowatts. And as I say, that's roughly equivalent to 20 domestic kettles. So that same 9-meter tower, though, will produce 25 tons of crops a year. Many people will be saying, I'm sure, there is a lot of talk, this is action. So COP26, the main site is 300 meters downstream from here. Our strategy here is very much to engage young people. So we have around 50 schools from across the UK coming in here, and what we have around the outside walls of our exhibition is hopefully an engaging exhibition to inform young people about the future of their food and the future of farming, and hopefully to inspire a few of them to get involved with this type of technology, whether it be as farmers or whether it be as data scientists figuring out how to grow the next set of crops.
There we are, and thanks to Amber for going down to the Broomielaw earlier this week to gather those two interviews for us. So John, firstly picking up on one of the points made by the Chief Executive of IGS there, to support the innovation of vertical farming, do you think one of the things that we should do is to print the carbon footprint of individual produce on the packet or the receptacle that we buy it in when we go to the supermarket?
Well, it sounds a good idea. I mean, I have to say personally, I hardly ever read anything on a box or a packet of any kind. Give me some flat pack furniture, and I'd have a go at it first without reading the instructions. So I'm maybe the wrong person to ask here. I think there is a tendency to ignore, but I'm not the only one. I think who tends to ignore a lot of what's on packets. So I'm not sure. I think that presentation was very impressive, and the presenter there clearly knew which points to hit. The relocalization of food production, that strikes me as a very, very important point. The idea that, we've seen this Conservative government doing deals with Australia and New Zealand to ferry food around the planet, almost or more than halfway around the planet sometimes. Food that can be grown here, or animal forms of food that can be reared here. That is crazy. That is absolutely crazy. And these vertical farms, perhaps I could be naive here. There may be issues that I don't know about with vertical farms, but it does seem very impressive, and also looks like a far happier place to work in than an average Scottish field.
Absolutely, John. On the point you're making there, Do you think there's a prospect that the small number of trade deals that the Tory government have signed so far, including, as you say, with New Zealand and with Australia, do you think there's a possibility that they will be overtaken by climate change events? And in fact, what little substance they have, which, as you say, in the case of New Zealand, seemed to be about importing New Zealand lamb, do you think that they will never actually come into effect because the climate crisis and measures to reduce the increase in the planet's temperature will make people reject the huge amount of air miles or shipping miles that lamb and other produce bought from the other side of the world involves?
Yeah, as you say, as the crisis accelerates, as it increases, then these trade deals strike me as the most obvious first targets and the weakest element in the system. That it's hard to see how they will survive. They may run for a year or two, I don't know, but increasingly it'll become more and more obvious that there's huge waste there and also huge cost that's somehow being offset somewhere else, so that meat or whatever else it is can be sold cheaply in Scotland.
Thanks, John. And actually, it was crossed my mind when we were looking at that package. You'll have a much better idea than me. How long ago was it that there will last have been farming on the Brumelaw?
Yes, very good. I wouldn't like to guess.
It must be at least 150 years, if not longer. So it's an interesting approach. It struck me when watching the video that the very shiny, the very technological nature of vertical farms, such as the one we saw in the package. It struck me. Do you think how do you feel about such technocratic and technological solutions, overtly technological solutions, almost industrialization in a sense, being introduced into farming practice in Scotland?
I think I've had a concern. I mean, I have certain intolerances in the area of food, including dairy. So perhaps I came across as a bit biased about dairy. But my worries apply in conventional farming, and they relate to the additives, the various chemicals injected, put into animal feed, which I think are a far greater risk to our health, and also the preservatives used, which are strongly associated sometimes with cancers, with ADHD in children, and so on. So I think verticality itself doesn't seem to me an issue. I can't see food produced in that way is by definition any more dangerous. In fact, it might be less dangerous if they don't need to use some of these terrible chemicals they're using in the fields.
That's a very good point, and certainly those sort of industrial ways of raising crops, in particular, I know from my own experience, are being explored and developed in the Middle East, and again for the same reasons that they wish to grow fruit and vegetables much more locally and not being importing them from around the world, and also in Japan, where former production facilities for microchips are being repurposed into indoor farms and vertical farms, and to your point, because the environmental conditions can be managed very, very, very precisely in those type of facilities, and so there isn't the need to resort to quite the extent of chemical treatments and additives, because you're much more able to control the growth of the crops by controlling the environment within which they're growing. But so do you think that there is here the vertical farming, in the same way as we were discussing a moment ago, in terms of making changes to the way in which cattle burp in Scotland? Do you think that vertical farming might also offer, if either an example or is an indication of a pathway for Scottish agriculture to help as we all begin to change our behaviours and our practices in order to address the climate crisis that's upon us?
Yes, I mean, I can imagine some saying, well, you can't farm beef cows vertically. That's not going to work. You have to have reinforced steel farm for cows being grown vertically. But there are parallel developments in the production of protein without using animals, which may replace that as well. So I I hate to be an enthusiast for something because in a fairly long life, I've learned that being enthusiastic for things can get you into trouble, and then you look back 10 years later and think, did I say that? Oh my God. But I can't help but feel it looks very promising.
Absolutely right, John. I think in terms of urban cattle farming, I certainly remember pictures of barges in harbours in the Netherlands, I think, with urban harbours with cattle
Yeah.
being raised on the barges as a way of bringing them into the town and using the space that wasn't being used for anything else. So we'll see, but certainly the next time I'm talking to a cattle farmer or a dairy farmer, I'll ask them about the prospects of vertically farming, raising beasts, and we'll see what they say. But what we'll do is we'll move on to another COP26 related story. And that is that the SNP has said it is essential that the UK government delivers ring-fenced investment for tidal stream energy to combat climate change and to achieve net zero emissions. On a visit to Nova Innovation's manufacturing facilities in Leith today, Ian Blackford MP called on Boris Johnson to deliver a dedicated budget in the upcoming Contract for Difference auction for tidal stream energy in order to secure the future of the industry and deliver thousands of jobs. Now, the very hard-working Amber was also able to go and speak to the politicians and the businesses who were meeting in Leith earlier today, and so we'll have a look at a VT package of that meeting as well now.
What I'm asking is that the UK government gets behind our tidal marine industry. We know from a Royal Society report that this is an industry that could deliver 15% of the UK's electricity requirements, deliver the baseload energy that we need, and it can be done in an affordable way. What we're asking for is the UK government to have a ring-fenced pot of £71 million. So companies like Nova and Atlantis, who we're with today, have that opportunity to develop a market here in Scotland, deliver jobs in Scotland to deliver that greener future that we all want. These companies are exporting turbines to Japan and Canada, and yet we've got a UK government that's not yet putting the financial support in place that we need. We put this in context, we're asking for just over £70 million a year. Nuclear has a budget to develop it of £2.2 billion. We don't want nuclear in Scotland. We do want to have that opportunity of developing our own technologies that we have here, the centre of excellence that we have here in Leith. And it really is about time. The UK government is serious about climate change, serious about getting to restraining growth in temperature to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, that we need to have these green energies developed here using the technology we have, the expertise we have, the opportunity for jobs, and that dependable energy creation. This is not an argument that we should be having. It's a decision that the UK government needs to recognise. Here is an opportunity to develop an industry which is world leading from here in Scotland, develop the energy, develop the jobs that we all need. I mean, obviously we want to see a balance to our energy policy here in Scotland to make sure that we can benefit from all these technologies. But the differential that we have with tidal marine is it's dependable. When you think about traditional wind, and you think about solar, you need the wind to be blowing, you need the sun to be shining. Tides are dependable. Tides come and go twice a day off our shores. So here is an opportunity to give us the base load to develop something which we know can be done on an affordable basis, where we have got the technologies that will allow us not just to have an industry at home, but to export turbines around the world. What an opportunity for Scotland to have a world-leading industry. The UK government needs to make sure that the modest financial support that we're asking for is in place to allow the industry to develop.
I'm Alan Brown, I'm the SNP spokesperson for energy and climate change, and this is all about creation of renewable energy, stable renewable energy, but more importantly jobs here in Scotland. This is about building up manufacturing opportunities and then also exporting the technology around the world. And what we've heard today is actually already the two companies here involved are already exporting turbines to other countries in the world. So it's high time that the UK government got behind them, give the support that's needed in the energy auctions coming up, and allow us to grow these opportunities and not miss out the way we missed out on onshore wind years ago. As we know, we've got the net zero targets here in Scotland 2045, so therefore we need to get away from relying on fossil fuels. So ergo we need to stop using oil and gas at some point. This will give us stable, renewable energy innovation, and that's exactly what we want: predictable, dependable energy from a clean, green source.
There we are. Now, as we heard the SNP Westminster leader saying there, tidal stream energy has the potential to be a major Scottish success story and deliver a significant boost to the Scotland-made manufacturing industry But in order to flourish, it requires the UK government to commit to a ring-fenced pot of at least £71 million a year by the end of this month, as part of the current contract for difference discussions. And also, it's worth bearing in mind that research from the University of Plymouth has found that tidal stream power has the potential to deliver 11% of the UK's current annual electricity and play a significant role in the drive for net zero as a predictable and reliable means of meeting energy demand. However, that study also highlighted that the current configuration of the UK government's funding schemes is restricting opportunities to accelerate innovation and to drive down the cost of tidal generation technology. So, John, firstly, do you think here, in terms of stories that we've seen over the past 2 weeks, can a comparison be drawn between Westminster blocking the Acorn carbon capture scheme for at least 10 years and now seemingly ignoring tidal stream power?
Yes, it was a very comprehensive report there, and towards the end, Ian Blackford covered the point I was preparing myself to make, and that's the tremendous potential in tidal energy production generation is, as he said, it's not dependent on changing weather conditions. We've made tremendous strides in the generation of electricity from wind, but it does have that one weakness that at times of calm, you generate less. And I suppose once we develop greater battery storage, maybe that will be resolved that way too. But tidal power is tremendously useful. We have the world's biggest tidal power turbine between Orkney and Scotland mainland at the moment running. There's a great deal of expertise here, clearly. And we also have, I don't know the figures, but we also have most of Europe's tidal energy in these narrow strips of fast-moving water between Orkney and mainland Scotland, between Jura and Islay, and various other places. Tremendous scope here. And to finish, the Plymouth University say we can develop 11% of the UK's electricity from tidal power. That 11%, of course, given that most of it would be done in Scotland, is more than 100% of Scotland's electricity needs.
No, that's a very good point that you make. And it struck me, Ian Blackford also made reference to the apparent enthusiasm on the part of the HM government for small nuclear power stations. And there have been discussions about that over the past few days, including with the business secretary. As I understand it, the main supplier or the main proponent of those facilities is Rolls-Royce, who are based in Derby. So do you think now Derby has 2 Labour MPs and the rest are Tory MPs. Do you think that, again, we're perhaps seeing an example of English politics getting in the way of bigger issues?
Yes, the first thing to say about nuclear power is it's not green at all. The notion that it's in some way green, I know the GMB, Scotland's least favourite trade union, have been pushing hard for nuclear generation as somehow as a green solution. I think some of them were actually at the marches. I think the GMB actually marched with the climate change protesters. I mean, incredible, a union that supports nuclear power, Trident and fracking, turning up to march with climate change protesters. It's nuclear power, regardless of how you do it, produces waste. And it's terrible waste. It's waste of tremendous potential to kill for hundreds of years, and you have to bury it somewhere. And if you keep on burying it, you're eventually going to have trouble in that way. So that would be the first thing to say about that. And I think, as you correctly point out, there are political factors involved here. I mean, I think Scotland was clearly punished with regard to the carbon, I've forgotten its name now, the carbon capture scheme up in the northeast.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, clearly we were punished. I think perhaps the coalition of the Greens with the SNP pushed that one over the edge, because with the Greens, I agree with the Greens on this. Carbon capture is a cover up. And you used the word earlier, and I've forgotten what it was about. But you either deal with a problem, or you kind of half deal with it. With regard to the cow's meat in there, I forget what the word is.
It was mitigating or solving.
Exactly, yes. So carbon capture is mitigating. It's not solving. Carbon capture is very expensive and actually encourages greater carbon production elsewhere, encourages governments to just say, oh, well, we can have more generation of carbon and we'll just deal with it with carbon capture. So it's worth having a look at what the Greens have to say about that.
Absolutely right, John. Now, we know that Nova Innovation have installed an array of turbines on Shetland, or in the waters around Shetland, and I think they're on the course of expanding that array at the moment. And one thing that struck me is that, and also I should say that Nova Innovation have signed a deal with Tesla in order to use Tesla's battery technology in order to, as you were pointing out, store the energy that's created in order that it can then meet both peak demand and also background demand using the battery technology. So it struck me that if the example from Shetland is followed, and so you see the power that is generated locally stays local, it goes into local people's homes and to local businesses. Do you think that one of the reasons that tidal stream power isn't finding favour with the current Westminster government is that it potentially presents a threat both to the big six power generators and to the national grid, which is in private hands as well?
Yes, that seems an obvious conclusion to draw there. And of course, the decision makers in the Conservative cabinet are looking to the future when they're no longer cabinet ministers and when they're invited onto lucrative positions on the board of various energy production companies, including the nuclear power ones.
Thanks, John. And I think the last point to make about Nova Innovation, and as you alluded to there, is that we know that they've reached a deal with the Crown Estate Scotland to install a turbine array in the Sound of Jura, and that brings the prospect of, in the next few years, the decarbonised production of whisky, which I think we can all support and all get behind.
Yes, indeed. I have to admit I've got a problem with Islay whiskies. I'm not so good on the peaty ones. My preference is from the whiskies of the North East. I wonder, is there some scope here also to use the Corrie Vrecken? Can we put something down at the bottom of the Corrie Vrecken and use its power?
There's definitely a lot of energy in the Corrie Vrecken. There was the last time I went past. So your point's well made. We have tremendous opportunities with wind and wave and tidal in Scotland and hydro. And that the innovation that we've been seeing highlighted today is very striking, and we need to do all that we can to pursue it. But that's the last of our items and the last of our stories for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. I should say it's also worth bearing in mind that if you would like to have an independent broadcaster, for example, like N1 from Bosnia, with whom we've been collaborating during the first week of the COP26 conference, then in order to have a broadcaster like N1, then we will require your support, and we would like your support to achieve that. Meantime, please join us here again at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening with Scotland at 7. I'd like to say many thanks to Professor John Robertson for his time and his contributions this evening. Thanks, John.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I'd like to also say thanks to everyone else for joining us and for watching Broadcasting Scotland this evening. I hope that you, and I should say also finally, that's very much the way it is in Scotland at very nearly 8 o'clock. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.